Varun Dhawan is not a star anymore. And no one seems to care. Don't believe me? Scroll through the reactions to the Border 2 promotional material. You'll find outrage, you'll find jokes, you'll find debate about nationalism, about nostalgia, about VFX, or even whether this film should even exist. What you won't find much of is Varun Dhawan. He's in the frame, but not in the conversation. And that silence matters more than any backlash or those few memes we're seeing these days after the first song released. Because this isn't a video about a teaser people disliked. It's about how a mainstream star can slowly fade from relevance, not by failing loudly, but by no longer shaping the discussion at all. And in Hindi cinema, invisibility is often the beginning of the end. But to understand how Varun Dhawan became invisible, we have to go back to a time when he was impossible to ignore. Before talking about Varun Dhawan's current situation, there is something important we need to establish first. Varun Dhawan once genuinely worked. And I don't just mean box office numbers. I mean culturally. I mean with the audience that actually decided who becomes a star. Let's start with Student of the Year. Yes, Student of the Year has aged badly. Its world feels fake, its conflicts feel silly today, but I really enjoyed it when it released. And that matters because it was made for people like me at that time, teenagers. This might sound strange now, but Student of the Year was a perfect launchpad. In the same way Kuch Kuch Hota Hai was in the late 90s. If you were not a teenager when Kuch Kuch Hota Hai released, chances are you probably couldn't sit through it even back then. And it's the same with Student of the Year. People who had already passed that phase were never going to connect with it. But for its target audience, it landed. I remember it very clearly. It was cool to wear jackets like Varun and Siddharth. It was cool to style your hair like them. It was cool to want to look like them. That kind of influence doesn't come from good acting. It comes from connectivity. And Student of the Year created that connection. Unpopular opinion or not, it did its job perfectly. Now here's the more impressive part though. Varun didn't just write that success. After Student of the Year, he stepped up in a big way. Between 2014 and 2018, Varun delivered multiple hits, especially in rom-coms. But what really stood out was how he used that success. Very few actors manage this. Varun took the credibility he earned and transferred it across completely different genres. And the audience followed. Badlapur was a dark, gritty noir with morally grey characters. This was not safe territory, and it worked. In fact, it worked so well that many people, including myself, started taking Varun seriously as an actor. I even made a full video analyzing Badlapur as a study of good and evil. Then came ABCD 2, a full-on dance drama, completely different audience, completely different appeal, and it worked. Dishum followed, an action comedy, slightly familiar, but still showing that Varun could carry big-budget, massy, action-led films. And that worked too. Then there was Sui Dhaga, a small, light-hearted, aspirational film. No glamour, no star image, and that worked as well. And finally, October, a very quiet film. Long stretches where nothing really happens. Minimal dialogue, no commercial hooks. This is the kind of film most mainstream actors avoid completely. But Varun did it. And it worked. Now here's the key point. Even after all of this, when Varun returned to his own rom-com genre, Badrinath Ki Dulhania felt fresh. The audience accepted him without hesitation. It was a huge hit. Think about what that means. The same audience that watched him bash someone's head with a hammer in Badlapur had no problem cheering for him in a romantic film again. That level of audience trust is rare. And that is exactly why Varun Dhawan still deserves discussion today. Not because he's currently successful, but because there was a time when the audience believed in him. They followed him across genres. They accepted change. They showed up. And once you understand that, you understand why his current phase feels so disappointing. Even during Varun Dhawan's best phase, there were early warning signs. In fact, I pointed this out 5 years ago. My main criticism back then was simple. Varun was slowly starting to take the safe route. At the time, it didn't feel dangerous because the films were still working. Take Dilwale. It wasn't great, but it also wasn't really a Varun Dhawan film. It was an SRK project with huge names and scale. From Varun's side, it still made sense. So I don't count Dilwale as a major misstep. The real damage, though, began with Judwaa 2 and later with Coolie No. 1. On paper, Judwaa 2 looked like a sure hit. Nostalgia, loud comedy, and most importantly, Varun still had a lot of credibility. That goodwill carried the film to big numbers. But those numbers were hiding a problem. These films quietly alienated Varun's core audience, teenage girls, young adults, the same audience that supported him from Student of the Year to Badrinath. The issue wasn't just quality, it was the content. Judwaa 2 and Coolie No. 1 treated harassment and disrespect as comedy and romance. This might have worked in the 90s, but Varun's audience by then was far more socially aware. Compare that with Badrinath Ki Dulhania, still a rom-com, but with respect, empathy, and accountability. That difference mattered. On top of that, Coolie No. 1 then released on OTT during COVID, and that changed everything. There was no opening weekend buzz, no theater shield. People watched it carefully and rejected it outright. COVID also meant something else. Audiences now had access to a much better content library. Expectations changed, and for the first time, Varun's safe choices were fully exposed. By the time theaters reopened, the damage was already done. He hadn't just delivered weak films, he had lost his most important asset, the trust of his core audience. After Coolie No. 1, Varun Dhawan clearly did try to recover. This is important to say. It's not like he completely gave up or stopped making effort. Films like JugJugg Jeeyo and more recently Sunny Sanskari are not disasters. They are passable. And that's the problem. Earlier in his career, passable was enough. Humpty Sharma Ki Dulhania was passable and it worked. But the film came out almost a decade ago. In between, a lot has changed. COVID happened, audiences' habits changed, streaming changed expectations, and most importantly, Varun's audience grew up. What worked in 2014 cannot work the same in 2024. But Varun's choices suggest he's still chasing the same old comfort zone. And by now, that comfort zone feels outdated. This is where Dharma Productions enters the picture. Dharma itself is going through an identity crisis of their own. Big budget failures, confused risk taking, no clear creative direction. And Varun unfortunately has been stuck in the middle of this confusion. Look at the so-called risks he has taken. Kalank was presented as a bold move. But was it really? It was a massive period drama with huge cast, grand visuals and big music, released right after Padmavat became a blockbuster. There was already a proven formula, and it failed badly. Bhediya was more interesting, but even that was part of an established universe. There was still a safety net. Baby John was meant to tap into that South-style mass action wave that had just worked brilliantly with Jawan. But instead of originality, it too was a remake. By then, remake fatigue had already set in, and the audience rejected it. Even Citadel, his entry into the OTT space, didn't really move the needle. No buzz, no cultural impact, just silence. What ties all of this together is not failure, it's fear. These weren't risks taken for creative reasons. They were calculated attempts to hit jackpot, to catch a trend, to borrow success. That's very different from what Varun did in his early years. Which brings us to 2026, and the two films currently lined up. First, Border 2, a sequel riding on nostalgia, selling patriotism as spectacle, and Sunny Deol's recent resurgence. The teaser itself sparked backlash, and noticeably, almost no one talked about Varun in it. He felt replaceable. That in itself is a dangerous place for a star to be in, only for things to get even worse with memes and jokes directed at him ever since. And secondly, another David Dhawan collaboration after Judwaa 2 and Coolie No. 1. At some point, family loyalty stops being an excuse. Repeating a cycle that already damaged your career is not self-discovery. And here's the irony, Varun Dhawan often says that American Psycho inspired him to become an actor. That ambition does not align with green screen chaos or safe nostalgia plays. The truth is, Varun has less to lose now than ever before. Which means he actually has more freedom. Films like Badlapur and October didn't give him the biggest openings, but they gave him something more important. Conversation, discourse, relevance. Dharma Productions itself took a genuine risk with Kill, and it paid off. That should be a signal. Audiences today are far more open to change than filmmakers think. Because right now, the biggest problem isn't box office failure. It's something far worse. People have stopped caring. And the only way back from that is not safety. It's honesty.